At 6:47 this morning Eastern Time, something happened inside the Pentagon that has never occurred in the entire history of the American military-industrial complex. The Department of Defense, acting through a mechanism that most Americans do not even know exists, formally rejected a presidential directive on defense spending and activated an emergency procurement protocol that bypasses White House approval entirely. The bill in question totals $4.7 trillion over the next fiscal cycle, and what happened in the last 9 hours represents the most consequential civil-military crisis since President Truman fired General Douglas MacArthur in 1951. This is not a bureaucratic dispute over budget line items. This is a stress test on whether the United States military can function when a commander-in-chief decides that institutional norms, congressional oversight, and basic fiscal reality simply do not apply to him. I need you to understand the weight of what I am about to tell you, because what happened today inside a secure conference room at the Pentagon is not just about defense spending. It is about whether the checks and balances that have held this country together for 2.5 centuries still function when someone with enough power decides they are merely suggestions. If you care about what happens to this country over the next 72 hours, you need to subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because the events unfolding at this very moment will determine whether American democracy still has a functioning immune system, or whether we have entered a new era where presidential power has no practical limits. Here is what we know. 3 independent sources, 2 from within the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and 1 from a senior aide to the Senate Armed Services Committee, have confirmed to us what happened in that room this morning. At 6:14 a.m., Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin convened an emergency meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, and the Comptroller of the Department of Defense. The meeting was not on any public schedule. It was not announced. The only reason we know it happened is because flight tracking data shows that 2 military aircraft departed from Joint Base Andrews at 5:42 a.m., carrying senior Pentagon officials who had been recalled from an ongoing NATO conference in Brussels. They did not come back early because of a routine budget meeting. They came back because the Trump White House had just submitted a defense authorization request so fundamentally disconnected from military reality, congressional appropriations law, and basic mathematics that senior defense officials concluded they could not implement it even if they wanted to. According to the leaked summary obtained by multiple sources and corroborated through independent channels, the request called for $4.7 trillion in defense spending over a single fiscal cycle, representing an increase of approximately 340% over current authorized levels. But here is the detail that should terrify every single person watching this video. The request included no funding mechanism, no congressional authorization pathway, and no explanation for how the Treasury Department was supposed to generate that amount of money without triggering a sovereign debt crisis that would make the 2008 financial collapse look like a minor recession. Now let me walk you through exactly what happened next and why everyone inside the Pentagon is using the same phrase to describe this moment: constitutional breaking point. Here is what you need to understand about the mechanism Trump tried to activate, because this is not some obscure legal technicality. This goes to the heart of how civilian control of the military is supposed to function. The President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief, but the Constitution grants Congress, not the executive branch, the power of the purse. Defense spending requires congressional authorization through the National Defense Authorization Act, and then appropriation through the Annual Defense Appropriations Bill. What Trump attempted to do this morning was bypass that entire system, using an executive interpretation of emergency procurement authority that legal scholars from across the ideological spectrum calling flatly unconstitutional. Former federal prosecutor Andrew McCarthy, who has defended executive power expansion throughout his career, told Fox News within 3 hours of this story breaking that this crosses a line he cannot defend. Constitutional law professor Jonathan Turley, who testified in favor of Trump during his first impeachment, said on record that this represents an attempt to appropriate funds without congressional approval, which is precisely what the founders designed the Constitution to prevent. Even Alan Dershowitz, who has defended every controversial executive action imaginable, said this morning that the request appears to violate basic separation of powers principles that have been settled law since 1789. Subscribe now if you want to follow where this crisis leads, because the implications are staggering and mainstream media will be 3 hours behind everything I am showing you. Let me show you exactly how we got here, because this did not happen overnight. This was a cascade of decisions, provocations, and strategic miscalculations that began the moment Trump re-entered the White House and decided that his second term would operate under fundamentally different rules than any previous presidency. January 21st, 2025, day one of the second Trump administration. The president issues an executive order declaring a national security emergency related to what he describes as catastrophic military readiness gaps that threaten American sovereignty. The order itself is 47 pages long and cites threats ranging from Chinese naval expansion to what it calls European free-riding on American defense commitments. Defense policy experts who reviewed the document noted immediately that the threat assessments contained factual errors, inflated statistics, and worst-case scenarios that no serious military planner would accept as basis for policy. But the order was not really about threat assessment. It was about establishing legal justification for what came next. February 3rd, 2025, Trump announces during a rally in South Carolina that he intends to double defense spending within his first term. The crowd cheers. Republican senators issue cautious statements supporting robust defense, but noting the need for congressional oversight. Democratic senators point out that doubling defense spending would require either catastrophic cuts to Medicare and Social Security or deficit spending that would destabilize the entire economy. Trump responds on social media by calling fiscal conservatives enemies of American strength and suggesting that anyone opposing his defense vision is compromised by foreign interests. February 18, 2025, the White House submits a preliminary defense budget outline to Congress requesting $1 trillion for the upcoming fiscal year, nearly triple the previous year's authorization. The House Armed Services Committee holds emergency hearings. Military acquisition experts testify that the Pentagon lacks the institutional capacity to spend that amount of money, effectively even if Congress authorized it. Defense contractors, who would ostensibly benefit from increased spending, issue carefully worded statements expressing concern about procurement timelines and workforce availability. The committee votes to table the request pending further review, effectively killing it in committee. Trump responds by declaring that Congress is obstructing national security and suggesting he will find alternative authorization mechanisms. Here is where the story takes a turn that nobody in Washington saw coming. March 1st, 2025, the White House Office of Legal Counsel issues a memorandum arguing that the president possesses inherent authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to direct emergency defense expenditures when congressional inaction threatens national security. The memo is 19 pages long and cites precedents from the Civil War, both world wars and the immediate aftermath of September 11th. Constitutional scholars who reviewed the document noted that every cited precedent involved either explicit congressional authorization or emergency conditions that do not currently exist. The memo concludes that the President can direct the Secretary of Defense to initiate procurement contracts up to $5 trillion if military readiness requires it, with congressional appropriation to follow retroactively. This is the legal theory that led directly to this morning's crisis. This is the framework Trump's lawyers constructed to justify bypassing Congress entirely. And this is what senior Pentagon officials concluded they could not implement without violating their oaths to the Constitution. Now let me tell you about the man who said no, because this is not some random bureaucrat looking for attention. Lloyd Austin is a retired four-star general who commanded United States Central Command, overseeing military operations across the Middle East. This is someone who spent 41 years in uniform, who led combat operations in Iraq, who understands chain of command better than almost anyone in government. Austin is not a political activist. He is not a resistance figure. He is a professional military officer who took an oath to support and defend the Constitution, not to follow illegal orders from any president regardless of party. According to people who have worked with him throughout his career, Austin operates according to a simple principle: the law is the law, and when political pressure conflicts with legal obligation, the law wins every time. That principle was tested this morning in ways that Austin never anticipated when he accepted this position. But here is what concerns me most, and this is the detail that has not been widely reported in mainstream coverage. The $4.7 trillion figure that appeared in the White House directive this morning did not come from the Pentagon. It did not come from the Joint Chiefs. It did not come from any serious defense planning process. Multiple sources familiar with the document's origins say it was generated by a small group of political advisors in the White House who reverse-engineered a number large enough to fund every defense fantasy Trump has articulated over the past year, from a 600-ship Navy to a Space Force expansion that would dwarf NASA's budget at its Apollo-era peak. The number has no relationship to strategic requirements, threat assessments, or military planning. It is a political number designed to demonstrate dominance and test whether anyone in the institutional chain will say no. This morning, someone finally did. If you are finding this analysis valuable, hit that like button right now, because this story is about to get significantly more complicated, and you will want to be here for all of it. Here is what happened in that secure conference room at 647A. When Lloyd Austin told the assembled military leadership that the Pentagon would not be implementing the White House directive. According to two people who were briefed on the meeting immediately afterward, Austin began by reading aloud from Title 10 of the United States Code, the statute governing military organization and the chain of command. He then read from Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which grants Congress the power to raise and support armies and to provide and maintain a navy. He explained that the directive from the White House requested expenditures that Congress has not authorized and that the Department of Defense has no legal authority to obligate funds that Congress has not appropriated. One source described the atmosphere in the room as absolutely silent, with senior generals and admirals understanding immediately that they were witnessing a constitutional crisis unfolding in real time. Austin then activated what is known as the Defense Emergency Protocol, a classified procedure that allows the Secretary of Defense to continue military operations using previously appropriated funds when political dysfunction threatens operational continuity. The protocol has been activated only twice before, once during the 2013 government shutdown and once during the 2018 to 2019 shutdown that lasted 35 days. It has never been activated in response to a presidential directive until today. And it gets worse. Within 90 minutes of Austin's decision, the White House issued a public statement declaring that the Secretary of Defense was insubordinate and suggesting that he would be removed from his position. The statement, which appeared on the official White House website at 8:23 a.m., accused Austin of undermining national security and placing personal political considerations above military readiness. But here is the problem with that narrative, and this is what legal experts are pointing out this afternoon. The Secretary of Defense serves at the pleasure of the President, but removing him requires following established procedures, including notification to Congress and a transition period ensuring continuity of command. If Trump fires Austin without following those procedures, he creates a situation where the United States has no confirmed Secretary of Defense during what is rapidly becoming the most serious civil-military crisis since Watergate. And if Trump tries to install an acting secretary who will implement the unconstitutional directive, he invites immediate legal challenges from Congress, defense contractors, and potentially members of the military itself, who have independent obligations to follow lawful orders only. Make sure you are subscribed with notifications turned on, because this story is far from finished. The next 72 hours will determine whether this crisis escalates into a full constitutional confrontation, or whether some kind of backroom negotiation produces a face-saving compromise that allows everyone to step back from the brink. What I am about to show you next is why I believe escalation is more likely than compromise, and why the timeline is shorter than most people realize. At 9:47 a.m., less than 3 hours after Austin's decision, Senator Jack Reed, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, released a statement calling for emergency oversight hearings. Reed is not a bomb thrower. He is a West Point graduate, a former Army Ranger, and one of the most respected voices on defense policy in either party. His statement was measured but unmistakable. The Senate will not appropriate funds that the Pentagon has not requested through proper channels, and any attempt to obligate funds without congressional authorization will be met with immediate legal action. 12 minutes after Reid's statement, Senator Roger Wicker, the ranking Republican on the committee, issued his own statement that did not contradict Reid's position. Wicker said the committee looks forward to receiving the Pentagon's formal budget request through established procedures. That might sound like standard congressional language, but people who understand Senate dynamics recognize it immediately. Wicker just told Trump that Republicans will not provide him with cover on this. When the chairman and ranking member of the Armed Services Committee issue back-to-back statements that align on process, that is the Senate telling the White House that there are limits to what Congress will tolerate, even from a president of their own party. But wait, there is something even worse I have not told you yet. According to sources familiar with discussions happening inside the Pentagon this afternoon, senior military officers are privately expressing concern that the crisis could affect operational readiness if it continues past the end of the current continuing resolution, which expires in 18 days. If Congress and the White House cannot reach agreement on a regular appropriations bill, and if Trump continues pushing for the $4.7 trillion authorization that has no chance of passing, the military could face a funding gap that forces suspension of training operations, delays in maintenance, and potential furloughs of civilian defense employees. This is what happens when political brinkmanship collides with the practical requirements of running the largest military in human history. Every day that this crisis continues is a day when readiness degrades, when allies question American reliability, and when adversaries calculate whether American political dysfunction creates opportunities for aggression. Let me bring this together, because we are running out of time and the clock is ticking faster than most people realize. Here is what all of this means. We are watching in real time as a president tests whether the constitutional system can force him to comply with limits on executive power when he simply does not want to comply. This is not about policy disagreements over how much defense spending is appropriate. This is about whether the appropriations process established in the Constitution still functions when a president decides it is an inconvenient obstacle. Lloyd Austin's decision this morning was not insubordination. It was fidelity to law. And the fact that the White House is characterizing legal compliance as insubordination tells you everything you need to understand about where this is heading. Let me lay out the three scenarios that are now on the table. Scenario 1. Trump backs down. Probability 15%. In this scenario, backroom negotiations produce a compromise where Trump withdraws the $4.7 trillion request. The White House and Pentagon issue a joint statement about productive discussions, and everyone pretends this never happened. Austin remains in his position. Congress passes a regular defense appropriations bill with modest increases, and the crisis dissipates. Why only 15%? Because nothing in Trump's history suggests he backs down when publicly challenged. His entire political identity is built on the idea that he never surrenders, never admits error, and always escalates when confronted with resistance. For him to back down now would require acknowledging that the Constitution constrains him, and that acknowledgement would undermine the authoritarian posture that his political movement depends on. Scenario 2. Constitutional showdown. Probability 50%. Trump fires Lloyd Austin within the next 48 hours and attempts to install an acting secretary who will implement the directive. Congress responds with immediate legal action, possibly including articles of impeachment for abuse of power. Federal courts issue injunctions blocking any expenditures not authorized by Congress. The crisis expands into a full separation of powers, confrontation with unpredictable outcomes. This scenario leads to months of legal warfare, congressional investigations, and a political environment so toxic that basic governance becomes nearly impossible. The 50% probability reflects the fact that this is where Trump's instincts and political incentives point, even though the legal and political costs could be catastrophic. Scenario 3. Military institutional resistance. Probability 35%. Austin is fired, but senior Pentagon officials refuse to implement the directive, even under a new secretary. The Joint Chiefs issue a collective statement that they will not execute orders that violate their constitutional oaths. This scenario represents a crisis unlike anything in American history, where the military essentially declares independence from civilian control in the name of defending constitutional limits on that civilian control. This is the nightmare scenario that the founders designed the system to prevent. and the fact that serious people inside the Pentagon are discussing it as a possibility should terrify everyone, regardless of their political orientation. Is this the beginning of the end, or just another chapter in the chaos? Drop a comment below because I want to hear from you. Do you think Trump backs down, escalates into constitutional crisis, or faces institutional resistance from the military itself? What did I miss? What angle am I not considering? I read every single comment, and your perspectives matter. What happens over the next 72 hours will determine whether the appropriations power that Congress has held since 1789 still means anything when a president decides it does not. Subscribe to this channel right now, because when the charges are filed, when the hearings begin, when any rulings are made, you will see detailed analysis here immediately. The stakes have never been higher, the constitutional principles have never been clearer, and the outcome has never been more uncertain. This is not a drill. This is the moment when we find out if our institutions can still enforce basic accountability when someone with enough power simply refuses to comply.